Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
As the national mammal and a symbol closely tied to the National Park Service and the national parks, bison are highly revered in the United States. But that doesn't mean they're free of controversy. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Recently, the staff at Yellowstone National Park released the final environmental impact statement on a bison management plan for the park. The preferred alternative in that plan calls for a bison herd ranging in number between about 3,500 to 6,000 animals after calving. The plan also calls for a continuation of the transfer of bison to tribal lands via the Bison Conservation Transfer Program and continuation of both a tribal treaty harvest and public hunting outside the park to regulate bison numbers. But is that a good plan? We're going to discuss that today with Erik Molvar, the Executive Director of the Western Watersheds Project, which long has followed how the Park Service has managed bison in Yellowstone. We'll be back in a minute with Erik.
The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life, full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Listener and reader support make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Erik.
Well, thank you very much, Kurt.
So, as I mentioned in my introduction, I wanted to talk about Yellowstone bison. And before we get into that, what is the Western Watersheds Project?
Western Watersheds Project is a nonprofit environmental conservation group that works to protect and restore wildlife and watersheds throughout the American West. And we focus primarily on public lands.
How long have you been around?
We were founded in 1993 by John Marvel in Idaho and began with a battle to secure the right to bid on a state grazing lease, which eventually, after 3 trips through the court system and traveling all the way to the Idaho Supreme Court, we did win, and we're now proud holders of that. But we've since expanded to the entire West and grazing issues and other public land issues writ large.
Yeah. So the Western Watersheds Project holds a grazing permit?
We do. We hold several, actually. I was able to bid on a new grazing permit in Idaho Sawtooth Valley just a couple of years ago on an area that's an important salmon and steelhead spawning creek. And to get the sheep off of that creek, which is Champion Creek, and now it looks much better and it's providing better habitat for those fishes.
So I'm guessing that when you acquire a grazing permit, you retire it.
That's right. We're not in the livestock business, so we're in the business of restoring healthy natural ecosystems and native herbivores. So,
once upon a time, there was talk about creating a Sawtooth National Park. Unfortunately, that didn't fly, but it's certainly a beautiful corner of the world and make a great national park, I think.
I think it would too. And, obviously we have a national recreation area there, but still there are a lot of commercial uses that are allowed. And, we could probably do better for that landscape.
Well, over in England, Great Britain, they actually create national parks and embrace local communities and businesses in some cases. A different model of national parks, but, if we want to protect landscapes and biodiversity, maybe we should look in that direction.
I think all things are possible and multiple designations should be looked at. And I think there's a lot of flexibility within the canon of federal environmental law to identify different designations. And some of them I think can include communities.
Yeah, that'd be interesting. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Yellowstone bison. As you know, the other week, the National Park Service came out with their final environmental impact statement on an updated bison management plan. And I want to get your take on it. I know you and the Buffalo Field Campaign have long advocated for healthy bison populations in Yellowstone and in the West, I'm sure. What do you think about this new management proposal that the Park Service has come up with?
Well, I think this new management plan is largely business as usual and a continuation of existing policies that are currently in place. And it's a squandered opportunity to open up bison conservation beyond the borders of Yellowstone National Park to include public lands out on the national forests and other areas that are important winter ranges from a natural standpoint, but from which bison are largely excluded by the Montana Department of Livestock and their policies, and the federal government's acquiescence to those policies to try and keep wild bison from migrating out of Yellowstone National Park, much like any other native wildlife species is allowed to do.
Yeah, yeah, and there is the controversy. Montana, of course, is concerned about their livestock industry and being contaminated, if you will, with brucellosis, a disease that causes livestock to spontaneously abort their fetuses. And of course, the irony is that it's believed that livestock brought the disease to bison. But furthering the irony is that it's been concluded that bison don't transmit brucellosis to Montana cattle or Wyoming cattle. It's rather the wild elk populations, correct?
That's absolutely correct. There was a National Academies of Sciences study that looked at every single instance of transmission of brucellosis from wildlife to cattle in the Yellowstone area, and elk were implicated every time, and there was never an instance of bison transmission of brucellosis. And quite frankly, it's a bit of a red herring because the ranchers outside the park who are doing the right thing and isolating their cattle from wildlife by constructing large fences around their haystacks and the areas where they have winter feed lines and concentrate their cattle, they don't have much to worry about in terms of brucellosis transmission. It's only the ranchers that are relatively lazy, that don't want to bother with taking the common sense precautions that maintain the separation between wildlife and their livestock that are at risk of brucellosis transmission in the first place. From Western Watersheds perspectives, I think we're looking at a situation where the wildlife are being demonized for a disease situation that was caused at the outset by the livestock industry and is best prevented by proper management of livestock and livestock operations.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering. I mean, obviously Yellowstone is a great source for bison, but also if you look to northern Montana, outside of Glacier National Park, the Blackfeet Nation has its own bison herd, and they want to expand their bison herd. And there's talk about letting that bison roam into Glacier National Park. How does Montana view that situation? Because certainly bison could roam off the reservation onto national forest lands and other public lands up there.
Well, I think the state of Montana has very little that they can do about the bison reintroduction on the Blackfeet Reservation because Glacier National Park butts up against the reservation for its in full length along the eastern end of the park. And so there are no private lands to speak of where the state could exert its management on bison. It's the tribes that have the sovereignty over those lands and the management over those bison. So it's really a question between the tribes and the Park Service there. And because we don't have the problematic Montana Department of Livestock and their urge to treat bison as livestock rather than native wildlife in that equation, I'm anticipating a lot fewer problems in Glacier National Park than we're having today in Yellowstone.
Yeah. What about if you move a little bit to the east of Glacier and the Blackfeet Reservation? You've got American Prairie Reserve and their bison operation. Does that pose a similar threat as the Yellowstone bison population does?
Well, I don't think that that's really seen as the same degree of threat because those bison had gone through quarantine for brucellosis. So I believe that herd of bison is brucellosis free and doesn't represent an issue for the cattle industry. And I think the Blackfeet and their bison population are in much the same boat. So I think it's really, in order to be able to transfer bison out of Yellowstone National Park, they're held in captivity for a long period of time. They're tested for brucellosis before they're allowed to be transported. And so there's a pretty strong certainty that the bison that do get transferred from Yellowstone to some of these tribal reservations or some of these other external recipients are brucellosis free.
Again, looking at American Prairie Reserve, they border with the Charles Russell Wildlife Refuge. And I know they would like to see the cattle grazing leases retired at the refuge so they could have more land for bison to roam onto. But Montana's been fighting that too, right?
I think that's right. And it's because the state of Montana is squarely behind its livestock industry and doesn't have any interest in allowing bison to roam freely as native wildlife, even on a federal national wildlife refuge. And the truth of the matter is that the high plains evolved together with bison. Bison are radically different from cattle in terms of the way that they use the landscape. There have been some studies from an arid range called the Henry Mountains in Utah that shows that bison will travel up onto steep slopes, range far away from water, graze relatively evenly across the landscape, whereas cattle, they evolved in the boggy forests of northern Europe. And so they are gravitate towards the stream sides and riparian areas that have the luscious vegetation and are most like their original habitats in Europe. And when they do that, those areas, whether it's in the Great Plains or in the Intermountain Basins, are the hotspots of biodiversity because they're oases in a landscape that's arid. Remember that originally, back in the 1800s, when the first explorers were coming west, the smarter among them recognized the 100th meridian as that line beyond which we had the Great American Desert, which included the high plains, which included the Rocky Mountains and included the Intermountain Basins. And that arid area really concentrates its biodiversity along the stream corridors and river corridors. That's where cattle tend to concentrate too, and where they do a lot of ecological damage.
Yeah, yeah. Now, going back to the difference between elk and bison in terms of transmission of brucellosis, several years ago here at the Traveler, we did a series of stories on bison and the brucellosis issue. And I believe, my memory serves me correct, elk are seen as an economic product for the state of Montana because they bring in hunting licenses and big fees for that. Why doesn't the state of Montana simply classify bison as wildlife and allow for a hunting season? I'm sure there's lots of people out there who would love to hunt a bison.
I think that's a really political question, and it's driven by the livestock industry and their preferences. And the excuse for getting rid of bison is brucellosis. But the reality is that the livestock industry fears that if bison were to roam freely across Montana and be able to graze in their native habitats throughout the state, they would be heavily competing with cattle for forage, and they would be making barbed wire fences problematic. They might be taking them down, making it more expensive to maintain their barbed wire fences. So the idea that bison and cattle are going to be easily compatible without significant changes on how we do ranching in the West is probably not reality. Although, if you pursued cattle ranching the way it was pursued in the 1800s, where you had cowboys on horseback that are herding the cattle and moving them around, they were doing that on landscapes that also had bison on them. So you can have that kind of compatibility. It's just the current business model of, kind of fencing things off, chucking your cattle out on the range and forgetting about them without any kind of management or stewardship. That kind of model is not very conducive to coexisting with bison.
Yeah, yeah. Now, turning back to the Yellowstone management proposal, correct me if I'm wrong. It's focused on, I think, a population of around three to 6,000 animals. They want to continue the bison transfers to the tribes. Again, the brucellosis clearance before they're released. Is that much different than what they've been doing for the past few years?
It's really exactly the same thing as they've been doing for the last few years. It's really just it's essentially rewriting the management plan to conform to the status quo and what the agency's kind of customary procedures have been. The problem with the way the bison are being managed in Yellowstone now, or at least one of the principal problems, is that the Park Service is treating them as a single population, when in reality we have two distinct and separate herds that don't breed together. We have a northern herd and we have a central herd, and the northern herd has become quite numerous and might be able to sustain some losses. The central herd is decreased to the point where it's below the population viability that has been established by the bison researchers in Yellowstone National Park. And it's at risk. And that's why Western Watersheds Project, Buffalo Field Campaign, and others have been pursuing endangered species listing for the distinct population segment of bison that are in Yellowstone National Park. The other problem with the way that the Park Service is approaching this is they're not giving bison the freedom to roam into those Forest Service lands that are outside the park boundaries. They're not including the national forests as partners in this bison management plan. If they would let the bison spread out into Montana, even if they were only on federal lands, they would be able to range widely in the areas north of Yellowstone National Park and find additional winter ranges. And that would also spread out and not concentrate the tribal bison hunt that currently happens and is currently kind of bottlenecked into a small area by artificial human management, and creates a visual spectacle that's unsavory to a lot of people. And it would be a lot easier, I think, on everyone, on the tribes, on the bison, if that could occur over a much larger area and things could spread out, and the bison would have a fair chance of making it past that wall of lead that sets up when they open hunting seasons in the wintertime and along the boundary of Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah. How realistic, though, is it to expect bison to roam into the national forests, the high country, as opposed to just following the valleys?
I think that bison have proven that they're willing to do that. And, you had bison herds being led over mountains. They virtually have to anyway because of Yankee Jim Canyon and how narrow that is. It becomes necessary for the animals to find alternate, kind of methods of getting around some of these geographic barriers that have existed since time immemorial. So bison are, if left to their own devices, a wild species that's very adaptable and a species that is very well suited to its environment. And let's not sell them short.
It's kind of interesting. A few decades ago, I guess it's longer than that, back in the 1990s, early 1990s, when the wolf recovery plan for Yellowstone was launched, there was a lot of concern about the wolves going into Montana and preying on livestock and whatnot. And some of the conservation groups came forward and worked with the livestock interests to compensate them and whatnot. I wonder why we don't see that kind of collaboration with the bison issue. I mean, it's the national mammal of the United States. People love bison. People like to see bison. Montana obviously is drawing a black eye for its position on bison.
I think that's an interesting idea. When it comes to wolves, you can, have when a wolf predates on a cow, in those few instances where that actually happens, you can have a forensic analysis and you can do a necropsy on that cow and determine whether the cow died of natural causes and was merely scavenged by wolves, and that happens the majority of times when predation is claimed, or whether the wolves actually took down that livestock. And I think with bison, as they wander out into public lands or even private lands, and they're taking mouthfuls of grass, and those mouthfuls of grass could have gone into a cow. It's a lot more difficult to quantify the degree to which the rancher might have suffered or not from the bison grazing, and whether that grazing that happened on their property was due to bison or was due to elk or deer, which also graze on private ranch lands. So the idea that we should start compensating ranchers for grass that is taken by native wildlife opens a kind of a can of worms that I don't think a lot of conservation groups are very eager to open.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, another alternative, one that'd be even more expensive, transition those cattle ranches to bison ranches. Bison meat is considered a lot lot better for you than cattle meat. They're a lot easier to manage. I've heard stories about bison ranchers who, they don't worry about getting up in the middle of the night because a cow is having a difficult delivery. The bison seem to do just fine, and they're actually easier to manage.
I think that's true in a lot of cases, and certainly bison are a lot more compatible with native ecosystems than cattle are, and that's a big advantage as well. And we have the Flying D Ranch that Ted Turner started up near Bozeman, which it's been a very successful experiment raising bison as livestock, and it's been the basis of a series of bison burger enterprises that he's opened up all over the West, and I think that's been pretty successful. And bison is healthier for you than cattle. It's leaner, and I think it's considered a premium product that people will pay more for than they will pay for beef.
It really is, and some of the tribes have gotten quite entrepreneurial, and along with selling bison ribeyes and bison flank steaks, they sell the skull. They'll sell the cape, and so it generates quite a lot of money for them. So Erik, you'd mentioned Western Watersheds and the Buffalo Field Campaign have petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service both to consider listing bison as either a threatened or endangered species, as well as to recognize that there are two distinct, genetically distinct bison populations in Yellowstone. Let's take that first issue first, if you will. I believe across North America there might be 500,000 bison. Most of those, of course, are in commercial operations for meat production and whatnot. And I think 20,000 bison are in conservation herds intended to preserve the genetic makeup of bison. What's the argument for listing the species as endangered or threatened?
Well, first of all, we're not working to list the entire species as endangered and threatened. We're working to list the Yellowstone subpopulation as a distinct population segment. And under the Endangered Species Act, you can list an entire species, you can list a subspecies, or you can list a distinct population segment. And that distinct population segment has to be either genetically distinct from other members of the species or isolated from other members of the species. And of course, Yellowstone bison fall into that second basket. Also, Yellowstone bison are somewhat unique in being not pure in terms of genetics. There is some introgression of livestock genes into that herd they've now established, but it's a very, very low level. So it's the best available pure strain bison that we have. Under the circumstances, that's worth protecting. And then the question is it threatened with extinction, either immediately or in the foreseeable future? And from our perspective, given the constraints that have been placed on this herd, given that the herd, the population is divided into these two separate herds, one of which seems to be moving toward extirpation, which would leave only one herd left that would then be more susceptible to random events like disease outbreaks or climate-related stressors. We have to look at the question: are these populations at risk? And if you have in Yellowstone National Park, under the Park Service's management plan, 3,000 to 6,000 bison, and these are basically some of the very few wild bison in all of North America that are being treated as wildlife. That's pretty unique, and it's also a very small percentage of the 55 to 60 million bison that once roamed this continent. So this is something rare, this is something special, and it's something that's at risk. And we need to have strong federal protections to ensure that bison aren't being treated as they are today, like livestock, and they're not being, kind of harassed, harmed, killed, slaughtered. These things would all have to stop under endangered species listing.
Yeah, and it would possibly force the Park Service's hand to come up with a different management plan, correct?
That's what we think. We think that the Park Service would have to get serious at that juncture with their bison management and stop basically playing second fiddle to the state of Montana and its agenda to treat bison as livestock and prevent them from traveling freely like other species of Montana wildlife.
Yeah. Now, the other argument that you and the Buffalo Field Campaign have come up with is, as you mentioned, that there are two genetically distinct bison herds in Yellowstone. I'm curious about that because, back at the turn of the 20th century, there might have been 24 bison left in Yellowstone, all of Yellowstone, and those were, of course, the central herd at the time. Buffalo Jones, quite a character. That's another story to go down the road. Worked his connections to bring bison from other herds around the West. He brought a herd from, or some animals from a herd that was outside of present day Glacier National Park, and he brought some from Texas, the Goodnight herd. And he blended those, so to speak, with the remaining herd in Yellowstone National Park. So that was one herd. How do you turn that one herd in 1905 or so into two distinct herds in 2024?
I think the buffalo did that themselves. The buffalo breed during the summertime and fall, and then they mingle together in the wintertime, but they're not actually breeding together during that period when they're mingling in the winter. And so over many generations, those bison became separated from each other. They have their own kind of unique herds. And so they have to be treated as separate subpopulations within the overall Yellowstone distinct population segment, in our view. And if you lose one of them, then it's not going to be very easy for that herd to be replaced, in our view. So I think we want to save as many of these bison and as much of that genetic diversity as we can, because as you note, they all started from a very narrow bottleneck genetically at the beginning of the establishment of Yellowstone National Park. Then at that juncture, you don't want to lose any of your genetic information.
True. Now, you say, though, that the central herd is dying out, to use a phrase. What's the cause of that? I mean, you would think that it's an isolated herd, so it's protected from a lot of the ravages that the northern herd might be encountering.
It's the ravages of Park Service management that are causing the declines of the central herd. They're differentially being the bison that are being removed for slaughter, being removed for transfer. For whatever reason, they seem to be the ones that are affected much more by the Park Service's heavy-handed, livestock-oriented management of the bison herds than is the northern herd.
I'm not familiar with that. So they're effectively culling the central herd by
Yes, they're culling both herds, but they're culling the central herd to a greater extent than the northern herd, is what seems to be happening proportionally. So the central herd is carrying the brunt of when there are, trapping and confinement, quarantine, and removal, and when there's trapping and slaughter, because trapping and slaughter is part of the equation as well. And sometimes they're shipped away to different places to be slaughtered. It's the central herd upon which the burden of that population drain falls most heavily.
But isn't the trapping carried on at the Stevens Creek facility?
That's right. And they all do mingle in the winter. Why is it then that the central herd is differentially targeted? We don't have the answer for that, I don't think.
Yeah, interesting. Now, I've read your lawsuits pushing for two distinct herds. The Traveler has reported quite often on them, and the argument is if there are two distinct herds, that rather than a minimum of 3,000 individuals per herd, you basically double that. Is that correct?
That's right. You have to have viability for both separate herds if they are indeed separate. And the science is fairly definitive that they're separate. And the Park Service has been selectively ignoring that science. And the court has rapped them on the knuckles now twice and sent them back to the drawing board because they denied the petition to list the bison on the basis of the idea that we've got plenty of bison and it's all one population, that's one pool of bison. The courts didn't buy it because the scientists didn't buy it when the scientists looked at that very question and determined the answer. And the answer was, we have two herds. So it's time for the Park Service to start recognizing that biological reality and managing the bison accordingly.
Now, in the FEIS that came out, I dug down into one of the appendices, and it noted that there's a possibility of bison being listed either as threatened or endangered. And it says that the Fish and Wildlife Service isn't going to take a closer look at that until fiscal 2026, which I believe kicks off in October of 2025.
And I'm not even sure of the accuracy of that particular date, because it could be even later, because these dates have a tendency to slip even when they're on these schedules. So yes, the Fish and Wildlife Service is not moving with alacrity to get this decision done. They are somewhat dragging their feet. But I suppose if they want to continue down the path of playing things politically instead of following the science, and they know they're going to be dragged back into court again to defend a decision that's contrary to the science, then the longer they can delay, the longer they can continue to ignore their responsibilities under the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the Buffalo Field campaign came out roughly a year ago, saying the Yellowstone herd should be 50,000 individuals, 50. Is that correct?
Well, I've seen a lot of different things represented by a lot of different organizations, and I suspect that what they had in mind was a bison herd spread regionally across the suitable habitats that a native wildlife species should have access to if it were unconfined. And so one of the strange footnotes of the Yellowstone bison story is that we have them bottled up on a pretty small postage stamp of habitat. It's almost like when the United States government confined the Indian tribes to reservations. They confined the bison to this tiny little reservation called Yellowstone National Park. And it happened, unfortunately, to be mostly summer range and very little winter range, and didn't include the transitional habitats and the winter habitats that these animals would need. But originally, when Yellowstone was created, they were focusing mostly on things like geysers and fumaroles and things of that nature, more so than the native wildlife. And even where they did focus on the native wildlife, their understanding of natural migrations, ecology, wildlife habitats was very primitive at that stage in the 1800s. And not many lawmakers were very familiar. So I think it was an unfortunate footnote of history that Yellowstone was confined to such a small land area and didn't include the entire ecosystem. But it's not necessarily the case that bison must be contained within a national park. There are many examples of national parks that have elk and have deer that wander from national park into surrounding areas. And even in Yellowstone, these species do this. Why can't we allow bison to spread out? I think if we had bison spreading out over a much larger area, you could accommodate a very much larger herd of bison. And that herd of bison, as you mentioned earlier, could, support additional tourism, additional possibly hunting and other uses, and fulfill its native role in the ecosystem to the extent that it's currently excluded from.
Now, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, it's been called one of the most intact ecosystems in the world. I think the size of it starts at 18 million acres, and some people might say it's larger than 18 million acres. Any idea how much of that landscape is suitable for bison? I mean, obviously, they're not going to climb up to the roof of the Absarokas or go down to the top of the Tetons. And a lot of the valley areas are already subdivided and settled.
Well, certainly a lot of that habitat in Yellowstone National Park is not ideal for bison. Bison being grazers, focusing on grasses. So much of Yellowstone is lodgepole forest.
Right.
And lodgepole forest produces very little grass in the understory. That's not to say that bison aren't there and aren't using that. I mean, they use whatever's available. I've seen them in the lodgepole forests, but that's not their ideal habitat. Their ideal habitat is open grassland. And remember that back before, the American experiment and the arrival of colonizing farmers and ranchers in the American West and the Homestead Act and the settling of the West, we had bison that were in these massive herds of millions that migrated over vast distances. So I think this is a species that thrives upon being unconfined and able to roam freely across the landscape and seek out the resources that it needs to survive. It's a very hardy animal. The fact that we've been able to bottle them up in a subalpine habitat and deny them access to winter range for the most part, and still have a surviving population is somewhat a miracle and a tribute to their hardihood. But I think bison would thrive much better if they were given access to lower elevation habitats and have a broad continuum of different habitats to be able to live out their full life cycle.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the Interior Department's trying to do that now with their bison plan to restore native habitats with bison where it's feasible.
Yes, I think that would be, kind of the ideal, and we have a lot of places all over the West where we've converted native habitats to non-native habitats or disturbed them to one extent or another. I think that bison could be an agent of restoration, where we can make room for them. But first we have to make room for them.
Yeah, yeah. Well, would that be one way to expand the number of the Yellowstone herd?
It's hard to say. I think it's possible. And I think the biggest way to expand the herd in Yellowstone is to expand the number of acres that are available to it. And quite frankly, the habitat that we have, especially in the north for the northern herd, is pretty saturated. And there are some areas where ecologists are starting to see impacts from the number of bison that we have there today. It would be good to create a safety valve and allow some emigration with an E, some egress from Yellowstone into surrounding habitats that are suitable for bison, so that we can both allow the animals to spread out and reduce their overall impact on the land, and go ahead and have more bison as well at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. Is the Forest Service opposed to that, or is it just again the factor of livestock grazing? I mean, cattle graze in national forests as well. Is that what's blocking the national forest from becoming open range for bison?
Yes, I think it's largely political pressure from the state of Montana. And the state of Montana doesn't want to see bison on national forest lands, even though they're federal lands. And the federal government has full control over what happens on its own federally owned lands. It doesn't have to be taking marching orders from a state government, which is a lower level of government. But for some reason, the federal agencies have been kowtowing to the state of Montana and its Department of Livestock, and running our national forest lands that belong to all Americans for the local and parochial interests of the state of Montana. And when I say the local and parochial interests of Montana, it's really not even all Montanans. It's the livestock industry.
Yeah, yeah. So what happens now? I mean, obviously the clock is running. The public review of this final EIS on bison management plan. Once I think it's a 30-day clock. Once that expires, Park Service most likely will sign off on a finding of no significant problems with the bison plan, and it'll go forward. Is that something that the Western Watersheds will sit back and accept, or will you challenge that plan?
Well, it depends on what the final plan says, of course. And, they've gone through the process of evaluating the alternatives through a draft and final EIS. But even at this point, the agency can pick among any of the alternatives or some combination for its final record of decision on this plan. We hope they're going to be moving in a direction that's favorable to the bison and favorable to the free roaming nature of this herd. And hopefully they can build in some provisions that keep the bison from being bottled up in Yellowstone National Park, because that perpetuates all of the conflicts that we see today, and also the controversy surrounding park management of bison and how heavy-handed it is.
Well, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. We've been talking today with Erik Molvar, the Executive Director of the Western Watersheds Project. Erik, thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll look forward to what the final decision is and what that prompts.
Well, thanks for having me, Kurt. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Here at The Traveler, we'll continue to follow both the Bison Management Plan evolution at Yellowstone as well as the efforts by Western Watersheds Project and the Buffalo Field Campaign to have the park's bison protected under the Endangered Species Act and to have 2 genetically distinct bison populations identified in Yellowstone. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.